Hi, how's it going? Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to say thanks to the person who has been a patron since I first set up a Patreon account months ago. Also, thank you to the person who gave me a super thanks recently. I don't know if either of you want to be called out by name, so I'll just say thank you. Today I'll be taking a look at the stick welding mode and a brief look at the plasma cutting mode on the Yeswelder CT2050. Why brief? Well, yeah, bummer. I can't really fault the machine for this. I tried something I shouldn't have, in a way I shouldn't have, and it's fine. I did some cutting before that, so let's get into it. All the plasma cutting I did was with the built-in air compressor. I have yet to connect external air. I have to say, it cuts well enough with the internal compressor that it's the only way I'd personally use it for most projects. There's a slight delay after pulling the trigger on the torch while the compressor starts and builds pressure before the arc initiates, but it's not too bad and it's not a big deal. And I was pleased with the way it cuts. Even when using the internal compressor, it puts out the rated 45 amps on 240 volts and the rated 25 amps on 120 volts. When running on 120, it will chew its way through 3/8 of an inch, but I'd call it severance rather than cutting. It's a little rough. It cuts thinner stuff just fine on 120 volts. On 240 volts, again with the internal compressor, it cuts 3/8 inch surprisingly well. I've only used a few plasma cutters, but still, this is the first one that actually felt like it had more power than a 30 amp hypertherm, despite the others claiming 40 to 50 amps. It might not blow anyone's socks off who's used a higher end machine, but this thing cuts way better than the Yeswelder MP200 and better than the cheap Cut 50 I've used. On 120 volts, it draws over 30 amps when maxed out, so it will trip a 20 amp breaker eventually if you make longer, continuous cuts. That was with the internal air compressor running though, which appears to draw about 3 amps. So if you're using external air, you can figure more like 27 to 28 amps of draw. On 240 volts, it will pierce 3/16 inch steel nearly instantly, and you don't even have to angle the torch. It punches straight through, no problem. If you're curious whether it will pierce 3/8 of an inch without angling the torch, the answer is no. No, it won't. Overall, it does a decent job even with the built-in compressor. It's not going to outcut name brand dedicated plasma cutters, but it's not bad, and the built-in compressor makes it very convenient for quick projects. Though you will have to connect and disconnect the torch every time because you can't leave it connected if you're going to do any welding. Yeswelder explicitly states that attempting to weld with the plasma torch connected will result in damage. After that, I moved over to stick welding. In terms of how it runs, there are a handful of stick welders that I've tried that I would say run really sweet. They just feel extra nice and controllable, and starting a rod is almost effortless. The CT2050 is not one of those machines. It works, but it's nothing special. The good news is that it is capable of the rated amperage. The bad news is almost everything else. Let's start with the arc force setting. It can be adjusted from 0 to 40. I initially left this setting at default, and I found that the output amperage on both 240 volts and 120 volts was consistently 15 amps above whatever the set amperage was. And I mean really rock solid consistently, to the point that when maxed out at 160 amps on 120 volts, I actually got 175 amps out. Turns out that was because of the arc force setting. But it doesn't have to do with arc length. See, on the CT2050, arc force doesn't increase the amperage when the arc gets too short. It simply increases the output, period. When set at 75 amps with an arc force of 0, I get 75 amps of output, consistently. With an arc force of 15, I get 90 amps of output consistently. With the amperage set at 75 with an arc force of 40, I get 115 amps of output, and all of those outputs are rock steady. There's no change based on arc length, just a solid, stable, consistent output. The manual describes arc force as a feature that, when it detects a short circuit of the rod, it will ramp up the amperage based on a certain slope curve, and that slope curve is what the arc force setting supposedly adjusts. It says the amperage will go as high as 250 amps momentarily, but once it gets to that max output, it will begin timing, and if a short circuit is still detected so many tenths of a second later, it will actually shut off the weld current. None of that happens. The welder does none of that. The arc force setting simply doesn't do what they claim. All it does is increase the amperage output by whatever the setting is. 70 amps with an arc force of 30. Oh, did I change it? Yeah. So 70 amps with an arc force of 30. Let's see how many amps we're actually getting out of the machine, then turn the arc force off, turn the machine to those amps, and see if it runs exactly the same. Okay, so we were actually pulling 105 amps, and it definitely did feel like it was running hot, so let's zero out the arc force, run it to 105 amps, and let's run it there, see if we're still getting 105 amps, see if it runs the same. With the exception of that arc force nonsense, the output is fairly accurate. However, contrary to their claims, the display does not show real-time amperage output while welding. It just shows what the setting is. I also found that when maxed out on 120 volts, the welder is basically unusable. Sure, you can get 160 amps or even more out of it if you turn up the arc force setting, but it draws crazy current from the wall and trips a dedicated 20 amp breaker in seconds. When set to provide 125 amps of output, it draws a more usable 30 to 36 amps. Still high, but I can run a bead a few inches long without tripping a breaker. When putting out 90 amps, it draws a very reasonable 20 to 22 amps, so you should have no problem running a 3/32 7018 at 80 to 90 amps on 120 volts with little chance of tripping a breaker. Unfortunately, the hot start feature on this welder does nothing. It simply doesn't have any hot start. I tested with it set anywhere from 0.1 second to the max of 0.6, and not only could I detect no difference in use, the oscilloscope clearly showed that even when the hot start setting is maxed out, there simply is no hot start with this machine. Amperage comes up to the set value and stays there. That's it. I tried with various combinations of amperage, hot start, and arc force, and there just never was any hot start. And whether because of the lack of hot start or some other aspect of the design, this machine was tougher to start an arc than some others. This machine also has a VRD feature, which reduces the open circuit voltage to 7 volts DC. I couldn't find any way to turn that off, and the manual doesn't tell how to turn it off. If I figure out how to turn it off, I'll provide an update to let you know if it changed anything. Trying to run 6010 was frustrating. If I ran at a reasonable amperage, it was a real struggle to get the rod going, and it will sputter and snuff out once in a while, even once it's going. If I ran way too hot, it was easier to get the rod going, but it still wanted to stick and it would sputter and pop for a few seconds before smoothing out. And in both cases, once the rod smooths out and gets going, it will mostly stay running, though it still sputters out occasionally, even when running hot. As we already found, the arc force setting simply increases amperage. I tried various combinations of amperage and arc force, and I confirmed that if I run this welder at 70 amps with an arc force of 30, I get around 105 amps of steady, consistent output. But if I turn the arc force to 0 and simply set the amperage to 105, it runs exactly the same. And this was true for all amperages and all combinations of settings. Adding arc force was no different than simply turning the output up by whatever amount the arc force would have added. If you didn't realize this was happening, you could almost think that the arc force made 6010 run a bit better, but that was just because it was running hotter, and it's exactly the same as if you just turn the amperage up. Overall, this isn't the worst machine I've tested at running 6010, but getting a rod going can be frustrating, and it really doesn't run that well. Just for comparison, here is another welder running 1/8 6010 set at 75 amps, and that is a confirmed 75 amps. The rod fires up first try with no issues, and it never hitches at all. So far, this machine is a bit of a mixed bag. Plasma cutting was surprisingly capable with the built-in air compressor, and the stick welding mode can output the rated amperage. On the other hand, max stick welding output 120 volts draws so much current from the wall it's pretty much unusable. The arc force setting isn't an arc force setting, and I question how safe that setting even is. Maxing the arc force setting can cause the unit to run at a steady, consistent output well above the rated output. Though in fairness, it does trip a 20 amp breaker pretty much instantly if you do that on 120 volts. And finally, the hot start is totally non-functional. So those are the results of my testing so far. In case you missed part 1, I'll link that in the description. And the next time, I'll dig into TIG welding, including steel and aluminum, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, if you have any questions, let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. Take care.